Welcome to English BookCast.
Hi, everyone.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a pretty influential book,
Yeah, definitely.
Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard.
Mm-hmm.
And it was originally published in French as Simulacra et Simulation, and later it was translated into Portuguese as Simulacros e Simulação.
Right.
And it's really kind of a fascinating look at how we experience reality.
Yeah.
In our modern world, and we'll be looking specifically at the 1991 Portuguese edition,
Okay.
published by Entropos Editora.
Sounds good.
And if you're enjoying these deep dives, please join the English BookCast channel.
Yeah,
And share the videos. It really helps the channel grow.
for sure.
So, what Baudrillard is really arguing in Simulacra and Simulation
Yeah.
is that our understanding of reality has become so saturated with signs, symbols, and simulations
Right.
that these representations now often precede and dictate what we perceive as real.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's not just that we see the world through a lens, the lens itself might be creating the picture.
Exactly. I mean, it's almost like we're living in a world of images.
Right.
And those images are shaping our reality. They're
Yeah.
not just reflecting it.
Yeah. And he starts off, he actually kicks off the book
Mm-hmm.
with this section called the precession of Simulacra.
Right.
And he has this powerful quote from Ecclesiastes.
Mm-hmm.
The simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. The simulacrum is true.
Yeah. It's really kind of a mind-bending quote.
Yeah, it is. So what is he trying to get at with that statement?
Well, he's really challenging our sort of conventional understanding of truth and representation.
Okay.
And so he outlines like a kind of progression of how simulacra,
Okay.
these copies or representations, relate to reality.
Okay.
And he starts with this idea of representation where a sign clearly refers to a real object. So you can think of like a simple road sign, like indicating a curve ahead.
Right.
It's pointing to an actual feature of the road.
Yeah, it's a very straightforward
connection.
Yeah, clear link
Yeah.
between the sign and the real thing.
Yeah.
But then things start to shift.
Right.
Become less anchored
Yeah.
to a tangible reality.
That's right. So the next stage is what he calls simulation.
Okay.
And here the sign, it begins to detach from a concrete referent.
Okay.
It starts to mimic something that may not even exist, or it creates a reality of its own.
Okay.
And Baudrillard, he famously alludes to Borges' fable about a map
Okay.
that's so detailed it perfectly covers the territory.
Okay.
All right. So eventually the map decays along with the territory.
Right.
But the implication is that the map, this perfect simulation, becomes as real as, or even more real than, the land that it depicted.
Right. So the point is that even though it was initially a representation of
Right.
the territory, almost becomes more real.
Yeah, it takes on a life of its own.
It takes on its own reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can think about that in terms of, like today's digitally altered images.
Right.
They present a reality that never truly existed.
Right.
Yet they can become the standard against which we measure ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's really kind of a profound shift in how we think about reality.
Yeah. And so the simulation isn't just a copy. It's actively shaping
Exactly.
that perception of what's real or desirable.
Yeah.
And then this leads to the third order.
Right.
Which is hyperreality.
Hyperreality, yeah.
So what distinguishes that final stage?
So hyperreality is where the line between the real and its simulation
Okay.
completely collapses.
Okay.
So we can no longer discern the difference.
We can't tell.
Yeah, we can't tell.
What's real and what's not.
Exactly. The simulation, it generates its own reality. And we experience this simulated reality as genuine.
Okay.
So, think about social media again.
Okay.
The curated feeds.
Yeah.
The perfect vacations. The flawless meals.
Right.
These are often highly constructed simulations
Yes.
that many people experience as the authentic reality of others' lives,
Okay.
which leads to, real feelings of inadequacy or envy.
Right. So it's not just a harmless presentation of a fake world. It's actually impacting people.
It has real consequences.
It has real consequences in the real world.
And the simulation, it becomes the new real.
It becomes the new real.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the book moves into the section called history or retro scenario.
Yeah.
So what is Baudrillard saying about how we relate to the past
Hmm.
in this age of simulation?
Well, what's really insightful here is Baudrillard's observation that history
Uh-huh.
increasingly functions as a kind of retro scenario. Right. And what he means by that is that, we rarely have direct, unmediated experiences of the past.
Okay.
Instead, our understanding is largely shaped by media.
Right.
Historical reenactments, documentaries, museum exhibits,
Right.
and these representations, while, they're aiming to inform,
Uh-huh.
they inevitably become forms of simulation,
Okay.
where the past is packaged and consumed as a spectacle,
Okay.
almost like a historical theme park.
Okay, so our understanding of history becomes more about the representation
Yeah.
than the actual lived experience of it.
Yeah, I mean, think about like how major historical events are often like condensed into, sound bites or dramatic narratives and documentaries,
Right.
and while this makes the information accessible,
Right.
it can also, flatten the complexities and nuances of the past
Okay.
and turn it into a kind of easily digestible simulation.
Right.
And the risk is that we lose, a critical engagement with history. And instead we just consume, this prepackaged version.
This prepackaged version of history, yeah.
Exactly.
Now, one of the more challenging
Yeah.
and debated sections of the book is his analysis of the Holocaust.
Right.
So how does he approach this profoundly significant event
Yeah.
through his framework of simulation?
Yeah. And this is a crucial point, I think, where nuance is essential.
Okay.
Because Baudrillard's analysis of the Holocaust
Mm-hmm.
isn't about diminishing its horror or denying its historical reality.
Okay.
Instead, he's grappling with how an event of such immense scale
Right.
and atrocity is represented
Uh-huh.
and consumed in our media-saturated world.
Okay.
So his concern is that the constant repetition
Okay.
and the sheer volume of images and information
Right.
can, paradoxically, lead to a form of hyperrealization.
Okay.
So the event, it becomes so monumental,
Mhm.
so constantly present in media, that it risks becoming detached from its specific historical context
Okay.
and the individual suffering that it entailed.
So almost too big.
Yeah, it becomes too big almost.
Too big to comprehend.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it transforms into this kind of like ultimate spectacle,
Right.
potentially losing its power to shock
Okay.
and provoke genuine understanding.
Okay, so it's almost like the representation
Yeah,
overwhelms the actual reality.
exactly.
And it kind of has a numbing effect.
Yeah, a numbing effect rather than deeper comprehension.
Rather than a deeper comprehension. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a really important distinction to make.
I think so.
So moving on. Baudrillard examines the film China Syndrome.
Yeah.
So what connection does he draw between this fictional movie
Uh-huh.
about a nuclear accident and his ideas about hyperreality
Hmm.
and societal anxieties?
Well, the China Syndrome, it serves as like a powerful illustration for Baudrillard
Okay.
of how fiction can anticipate and even shape our understanding of potential real-world crises.
Okay.
And what's particularly striking is that the film, which depicts the near meltdown at a nuclear power plant,
Right.
was released just shortly before the actual 3 Mile Island accident.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was almost like the movie.
Prefigured a real life event.
Yeah, it prefigured it.
Yeah.
And Baudrillard suggests that, more than just a prediction, the film tapped into and amplified
Okay.
existing societal anxieties about nuclear power.
Okay.
So the fictional disaster in the China Syndrome,
Right.
it provided this like concrete framework
Right.
through which the more ambiguous
Right.
and initially less understood events
Right.
at 3 Mile Island were interpreted by the public.
Okay.
So the simulation, the movie, it didn't just reflect reality,
Uh-huh.
it arguably influenced how that reality was perceived
Oh, wow.
and feared,
Okay, so it actually,
like blurred the lines.
yeah, our anxieties could be shaped not just by real events, but by the...
But by the simulated possibilities presented in our culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And then he turns his attention to another film,
Right.
Apocalypse Now,
Yes.
also in the context of simulation.
Hmm.
So what aspects of this movie about the Vietnam War
Yeah.
does he find particularly relevant?
Well, with Apocalypse Now, Baudrillard analyzes how Francis Ford Coppola's film
Uh-huh.
portrays the Vietnam War
Okay.
as a kind of descent into a surreal,
Okay.
and hyperreal experience. And the film, it moves beyond conventional war narratives.
Okay.
It presents like this chaotic, almost hallucinatory landscape where the boundaries between sanity and madness, reality and illusion become, increasingly fluid.
Okay.
And the intense imagery and the sense of moral ambiguity contribute to this feeling of a hyperreal war.
Yeah, it's often described as having like a dreamlike, almost nightmarish quality.
Exactly. And Baudrillard sees this not just as, artistic license, but as a reflection of a broader phenomenon where even real-world events, particularly those experienced through the lens of media and powerful narratives, can take on the characteristics of simulations. Right? So the film's exaggerated and often disturbing imagery, while it is grounded in the context of war, it creates this hyperreal portrayal that arguably speaks more to the psychological impact and the spectacle of conflict than to a straightforward historical account of the Vietnam War.
Right. Okay. Next up, Baudrillard delves into the Boberg effect, implosion and dissuasion, focusing on the Centre Pompidou in Paris.
Right.
So what does he mean by implosion in this context?
Yeah.
And how does it relate to this iconic building?
Well, for Baudrillard, the Centre Pompidou, or Boberg, is a prime example of implosion. And he sees it as a cultural space where different functions, like an art museum, a library, a public information center, and their associated signs are all brought together, almost colliding, without a clear hierarchy or traditional separation. Right. And so this mixing of disparate elements, it leads to a kind of neutralization of meaning. So the distinct aura or specific purpose of each element becomes diluted in this hyperfunctional space.
So by throwing everything together,
Yeah.
it's almost like the intended meaning or impact of each individual part.
Yeah, it kind of gets weakened or lost.
It gets weakened or lost.
Yeah, that's the essence of implosion. The specific gravity of each cultural form diminishes in this integrated multi-purpose environment. And Baudrillard, he also discusses dissuasion in relation to Boberg, suggesting that the sheer excess of information and functions acts as a deterrent to genuine engagement. Right. So faced with such an overwhelming spectacle, individuals might be less inclined to delve deeply into any one aspect. And instead, they just remain on the surface, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of stimuli.
So it becomes more about the spectacle itself.
Yeah, more about the spectacle.
Rather than a meaningful interaction with the content.
Right.
And then he transitions into the hypermarket and hypercommodity. So how does the modern hypermarket embody his ideas about hyperreality and the changing nature of goods?
Yeah, so the hypermarket in Baudrillard's analysis is this crucial site where commodities become detached from their traditional use value. And are primarily significant as part of a system of signs. Right. So in this environment of overwhelming choice and meticulously curated displays of simulated needs and desires, the actual utility or necessity of a product becomes secondary to its symbolic value and its position within the broader spectacle of consumption.
So it's less about what the product does.
Yeah.
And more about what it signifies, like what it says about us.
Exactly. The hypermarket, it fosters the creation and consumption of what Baudrillard calls hypercommodities. Right. And these are goods whose value is largely derived from their position within a system of exchange. And their ability to signify, status, lifestyle, or belonging, rather than their intrinsic usefulness. Right. So the abundance and the carefully constructed environment of the hypermarket, it contributes to this detachment from tangible needs and the embrace of simulated desires.
Yeah, it's almost like we're being trained to desire things that we don't actually need.
Exactly. And to find our sense of self-worth or identity through these simulated desires.
Through these objects, he also delves into the implosion of meaning in the media. So how does mass media contribute to this blurring of lines and the erosion of distinct meaning?
Well, Baudrillard, He argues that mass media, it plays a central and powerful role in the implosion of meaning by increasingly blurring the traditional boundaries between categories like information, entertainment, and reality itself. Right. So the constant barrage of images, messages, and narratives creates like this undifferentiated field where it becomes progressively difficult to distinguish between what is real and what is a mediated representation.
So news becomes entertainment. Entertainment tries to be informative, and the lines just get completely muddled.
Exactly. And in Baudrillard's view, the media no longer simply reflect an external reality. Instead, it actively constructs and shapes our perception of reality. Becoming this self-referential system of simulacra. Right. And the sheer volume and speed of information dissemination. It can also lead to a flattening of meaning. Where critical distinctions and nuances are lost in the overwhelming flow of data. Think about the 24/7 news cycle. Where complex issues are often reduced to simplistic narratives. For immediate consumption.
Just to get those eyeballs, right?
Exactly.
Following that, he presents this seemingly paradoxical idea of absolute advertising, zero advertising. So what does he mean by this apparent contradiction in the realm of marketing and consumer culture?
Well, Baudrillard sees advertising as evolving towards a point where it transcends its traditional function of simply promoting specific products. Right. And so absolute advertising, it's a stage where the persuasive techniques and the underlying messages of advertising become pervasive throughout the entire social fabric. No longer needing a specific product as their explicit target. Right. And the focus shifts to the creation and manipulation of desires, codes, and lifestyles themselves. Right. It's not about selling you a particular product. It's about selling you a way of life.
The way of life, yeah. Okay, and how does zero advertising fit into this picture? It sounds kind of like the opposite.
Yeah, it does. But zero advertising is the logical, if counterintuitive, outcome of this total saturation. Right? When the principles and techniques of advertising become so deeply ingrained in our culture and communication that they're everywhere, they essentially become invisible. Right? We are so completely immersed in the codes and messages of advertising that they become like the ambient background noise of our lives, this kind of pervasive simulation that we no longer consciously register as advertising. It's like the air we breathe. Always present, but often unnoticed.
That's fascinating. Next, Baudrillard has a section titled Clone Story. So how does the concept of cloning, particularly the idea of human cloning, relate to his framework of simulacra and the destabilization of originality? So
cloning, for Baudrillard, it presents a really profound challenge to our traditional notions of identity originality. And the very concept of reproduction. Right? And the clone, it represents the ultimate simulacrum. A copy that, in a sense, lacks a true original. The conventional biological or experiential sense. And it raises these fundamental questions about what constitutes uniqueness and authenticity in an age where even human life can potentially be replicated.
So the very idea of a singular original self.
It becomes undermined.
It becomes undermined,
And the clone, it highlights the potential for simulations to not only become indistinguishable from, but also to potentially supplant what we once considered the authentic or original. It blurs the fundamental lines between the natural and the artificial, the unique and the replicated, in a very direct and challenging way.
Okay, moving on, he discusses holograms. So how do these visual illusions contribute to his broader ideas about simulacra and the fading distinction between reality and appearance?
Well, holograms are, in a very literal sense, a manifestation of simulacra. Right? They create this compelling illusion of reality. This three-dimensional image that appears to occupy space. without having a tangible physical object at its core.
Okay.
So the hologram seems present, almost solid,
right.
yet it's fundamentally a projection.
Okay.
A simulation generated by light and technology.
Lacking a material referent in the space it appears to inhabit.
Right. So it's reality.
Yeah.
Presented as pure surface.
Exactly.
Without underlying substance.
Yeah, it's all surface, no substance.
Yeah.
And holograms, they vividly demonstrate how convincing illusions can be created and readily perceived as real, even though they lack the physical materiality.
Right.
We typically associate with reality.
Right.
So they further erode our reliance on physical presence as the ultimate marker of what is real.
Right. Okay. Baudrillard then turns his attention to J.G. Ballard's novel Crash.
Yeah.
That's a notoriously provocative
for sure.
and disturbing book.
Definitely.
So how does he connect its themes to his concepts of hyperreality and our relationship with technology?
Well, Ballard's Crash, it offers this really dark, extreme exploration of the hyper-real intersection of technology, particularly the automobile.
Sexuality and violence.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And the novel depicts this world where car crashes, these acts of destruction and potential death, become imbued with symbolic and even erotic significance. And the visceral reality of trauma is transformed into this hyper-real spectacle of fetishism and desire for the characters.
So the boundaries between pain, pleasure, and our technological creation.
Yeah, they become dangerously and disturbingly blurred.
Dangerously and disturbingly blurred, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the next section is titled Simulation and Science Fiction. What's the relationship that Baudrillard sees between these two realms?
Yeah.
Philosophical theory and fictional narratives.
Well, Baudrillard views science fiction as a genre that often directly engages with and explores themes that are central to his concepts of simulation, virtual reality, and the increasingly blurred boundaries between the real and the artificial. And science fiction narratives, they frequently imagine worlds where simulations are indistinguishable from reality. Where virtual environments become primary.
Right. Yeah.
Or where the very nature of what constitutes real is fundamentally questioned.
Right.
Right. And it's interesting because in this section, he also identifies these three historical orders of simulacra. And he talks about the naturalistic, which is based on imitation. The productivist, which is based on industrial production and replication. And then the cybernetic. Which is our current era. Based on information, models, and control systems. Right. So these are like the three phases of simulation.
So science fiction acts as both a cultural reflection of our anxieties about simulation and a kind of imaginative testing ground for its potential consequences.
Yeah, exactly. Science fiction, it allows us to explore like the logical extremes and the potential societal and personal ramifications of a world increasingly dominated by simulation and technologically mediated experiences.
Right.
So it serves as this kind of like cultural commentary and a space for imagining futures where the lines between the physical and the virtual become ever more indistinct.
Right. Okay. Then Baudrillard moves on to animals, territory, and metamorphosis. So what's his perspective on how our relationship with the natural world, specifically animals and their territories, is affected by a simulated environment?
Well, in this section, Baudrillard examines how our relationship with the animal kingdom is also mediated and transformed within a simulated world. And so these traditional notions of natural territory and the inherent wildness of animals they're challenged as they're increasingly integrated into human dominated spaces, zoos, farms, domestic environments, and represented through various forms of media, host